As an ardent gamer, I believe firmly in upholding the 3 core gamer principles. Every day I make a point to scream obscenities at my opponents online, be incredibly weird to voice actors on social media, and respect indie games. Yet I feel as though I've been shunning at least one of these responsibilities lately, as I have not yet made a video about Fraymakers. Perhaps the upcoming game I am most excited about of any in the world right now, and have been for 2 to 3 years. If you aren't familiar with Fraymakers, firstly, that's quite surprising because I've crowed about this game on this very channel before, but also because its Kickstarter and subsequent marketing went kinda crazy. But if you are one such person who is now looking at this game for the first time, the footage should be self-explanatory. It's indie Smash Bros, a concept that has been tried many times and never had the success that such an exciting idea deserves. Fraymakers has the most potential that a game trying to execute on this idea has ever had. It's being developed by McLeod Gaming, the team behind Super Smash Flash and Smash Flash 2, and as you can see, it's gorgeous. This game's presentation on every level, from characters and animation to UI and menus to stages and background art, is unreal. Every sprite has the detail of a Renaissance painting in a universe where Caravaggio likes drawing giant buff naked fishmen, and the soundtrack, I say with no word of exaggeration, is on track to become a top 5 all-timer for me. The few songs they've officially released already have blown my mind like I was JFK in the back of a limousine, and every new release only gets me more pumped full of proverbial lead. Admittedly, the game's early access release was shaky, even for early access, and as a Kickstarter backer I have been given some pause for thought over how slowly things have been progressing, but you simply cannot deny the quality of the content when it comes out. In my mind, the question is not, will Fraymakers be good? It's, when will Fraymakers be a real game? And right now, I don't know. It seems a bit farther off than I'd like, but when that time comes, it's possible I become a bit insufferable in how much I talk about it, as I can imagine myself wanting to make quite a few videos on this game. As a side note, I'd also really like to host a big online tournament around the time 1.0 launches, so keep an eye on that. I've already got an idea for the name. I think it's going to be called the Scrimblow Scramble. Original idea, please do not steal. Oh, other side note, at McLeod Gaming team members and devs, I follow like all of you guys on Twitter, and I'm in the McLeod Gaming Discord. If you guys ever want to like do something, you know, like, I don't know, I mean, I've got this channel, I've got the hard drive thing going, I don't know, I just figure we could like do something together, you know, like maybe like we could do a TikTok dance or something. Well, maybe not a TikTok dance, but you know, hit me up. Because I believe in the power of giving indie games visibility and loudly making demands of game developers over the internet, I believe it's high time I talked at length about Fraymakers at long last. I wrestled quite a bit with what the actual topic of this video should be, but I eventually settled on the old classic, these are the characters I want in the game kind of video, because I think it's a bit of harmless fun, and because I think it should highlight just how exciting the premise of this game is to those yet unconvinced. Again, this is indie game Smash. The pool of characters that could be chosen from is gargantuan, genuinely bigger than the well Nintendo had to pull from for Smash before they started pulling Sony and Microsoft characters from the fucking multiverse. They could put the fucking postmodern RPG guy in this thing. I mean, they shouldn't, but they could. Please don't. If you aren't in the know, Fraymakers currently has 6 confirmed playable characters, with an additional 3 to release by the time it hits 1.0, and an extra post-launch character to come per the Kickstarter stretch goals, though the devs have expressed a desire to work on the game long-term after release, and add even more characters if possible. So suggesting 10 characters here would hypothetically bring us to a nice even 16, which I think is a pretty reasonable amount for the roster of a fighting game designed by a small dev team to stop at, assuming they plan on doing a Fraymakers 2 or something someday down the line in like 2039. But who knows? Maybe they plan on supporting this one game after launch for longer than we even anticipate. They did it with Smash Flash 2, and the foundation is definitely there. Of course, this video is entirely recreational and just a mix of my personal tastes and wants with a dash of what I think is actually realistic. This is in no way me attempting to tell the devs what to do with their game, backseat design for them, or tell them I will not be interested if they don't put my hyper-specific character of choice in. I'm in no matter what. Now, with that being said, here are 10 characters they should put in Fraymakers, or else I will scream. But before we start, one last quick little addendum. There's a few things that won't appear on this list that might be a bit surprising to you. I have my reasons. Undertale, for example, as much as I would love to see it represented in Fraymakers, mostly by Sans, but really in any fashion, I don't think it's happening. Toby Fox seems quite hesitant to do the whole crossover thing, with only a couple exceptions, one in particular that is just in a totally different ballpark to a crowd-funded indie game. I just think Undertale is a bit too big for this, and having a very secretive, enigmatic creator who doesn't seem to collaborate too much doesn't help its chances, I don't think. Shantae is in a similar boat. She is in some ways technically a Nintendo character, which muddies the waters quite a bit, and WayForward are a big enough company entrenched enough in the mainstream right now that I have a hard time seeing them taking the risk of having Shantae appear in a game like this. I don't think it's impossible, I certainly think it's more likely than Undertale stuff, but I don't see it happening until the game is a proven commodity at the very least, and even then it's dicey. Spiritfarer and Celeste are two of my favourite indie games of all time, but I don't think there are candidates from those games that would make for a particularly interesting fighter. Give me assists from those games, sure. Give me stages from those games, absolutely, because good lord, I need some of that Celeste soundtrack in my life. But no, I'm not particularly interested in any playable characters from either of these games. Okay, that's enough preamble. Finally, let's get on with the list. Owlboy, as you can likely tell if you've played it before or are currently using the gift of human sight to comprehend the footage you're seeing on screen, is probably the most gorgeous pixel art indie game ever made. I think Sea of Stars gives it a run for its money, but nothing else is quite on its level in my estimation. Its main character is Otis, this sweet little bird guy, or Owlboy if you will, and you should. It's the name of the game. Owlboy's main unique selling point, aside from art that makes you want to renounce technology and live in a cornfield for the rest of your life, is Otis's partner characters, Geddy, Alphonse, and this broken little freak. When carrying these characters and flying with them, they can shoot projectiles to help Otis in combat as well as aid his traversal and puzzle solving. Admittedly, this is the one thing that makes me a bit hesitant about the idea of Otis being in Fraymakers, because implementing these partner characters as a part of his core gameplay would surely turn him into a zoner of sorts, which, I don't know, just doesn't really feel right for Otis as a character. And yet, while I think Otis feels more natural as a balanced all-rounder with multiple jumps in the vein of Pit from Smash, not implementing these partner characters would feel like missing a trick in accurately representing the game he comes from. So making him work in a fighting game like Fraymakers, and especially making him fun, would be a bit of a design challenge, I think. Regardless, Owlboy is a gorgeous, wonderful game that I think didn't quite get the time and the public consciousness it deserved, and I'd love to see Fraymakers make people consider giving it a second look. We have seen Otis in another more ill-fated crossover fighter that tried to execute on the same concept as Fraymakers, and so many others, so we know the devs are willing to play ball, though perhaps, like many indie devs, they're a bit more cautious about which games they allow their characters in after so many failed attempts at indie Smash. I don't know, he's only number 10 because of the challenges he presents and because I don't think he's quite the earth-shattering pick the team want to send this game's marketing into overdrive, but I'd love to see Owlboy represented, if nothing else for the stage and music. My god. So I'm fairly certain I don't have to explain what this game's about to you. Perhaps, however, I have to explain why Cuphead is only at number 9. I love everything about Cuphead. I love its art, I love its style, I love its throwback arcadey gameplay, but as was the case with Madeline and Stella and to a lesser extent Otis, I do have a hard time seeing how the devs could make a character like Cuphead fun or interesting in a fighting game. Okay, he would have Mega Man pellets, and what else? There's like a couple of things to draw from, sure, but I don't know if there's a full moveset here, and I'm sure you're going to mention something along the lines of how Sakurai made up full movesets for Captain Falcon and Piranha Plant, but this is a small indie team with limited time and money here, and the challenges presented by a character like Cuphead, and especially, again, making him fun, might not prove to be worth it in the long run, especially if it involves contending with Microsoft, who do not own the rights to Cuphead, but do have significant financial interest in the IP. It could all prove to be a bit too big an ambition, but I'd love to be wrong. Despite my reservations, I, like any sane enjoyer of hashtag gaming, would love to see Cuphead represented in Fraymakers, though I'm just not sure of how likely it is. One of the archetypes the Fraymakers roster is missing right now is a straight up swordie, and while Zagreus can, and likely would, use many different weapons, I don't think you can do much better in terms of that kind of archetype than this guy. Perhaps I'm just endeared to Zagreus on account of his voice acting being one of the only examples in recorded video game history of an American person putting on a pretty convincing English accent, but I think everyone is just in agreement in saying this game is cool and this character is cool. It's a bit hard to say how likely this is, as we still aren't that far away from Hades and we haven't seen Zagreus cross over into other things yet, though maybe that's just because there hasn't been enough time or the opportunities just haven't been there. Admittedly, this is a pick that would likely be a lot cooler for most other people than me because I myself still haven't played Hades, but I am able to recognise the game's objective coolness from afar. During his reveal, I think I'd be able to just sit back and be like, yeah, that's tight as fuck. Which is the thing I say. I talk like that all the time, actually. Okay, so this next pick is just for me. This is by far the least likely on the whole list. There's no doubt in my mind that this is just like on no one else's radar and this is just not happening at all, but I wanted to throw you a fun little curveball in this list. Here's my wacky weirdo pick. There's this game called Awesome Noughts. Yeah, the name is incredibly lame, but stick with me because it was lit. It was like a 2D 3v3 MOBA with much more inspired art direction and much less racist voice chat. Something that always stuck with me about Awesome Noughts was its character design, which I thought was truly top notch. The game was peppered with these sick, stylistic renders of these very western sci-fi characters, each of whom had their own unique theme song, some of which even sung their own theme songs. Seriously, Leon and Froggy G, to my recollection, sung their own theme songs, which, like, that alone is more personality than any other MOBA has ever had. So yeah, I just think it'd be dope to see an Awesome Noughts character in. They'd come with baked in abilities from the game, so adapting them to a fighting game surely wouldn't actually be that hard. In this far off parallel universe in which an Awesome Noughts character is playable in Fraymakers, I think it'd surely have to be one of the original characters from the earliest releases, as they have the most legacy in the game and are obviously the most iconic. Sheriff Lone Star is the poster boy of the game and probably the first choice, but I also think he'd be the least interesting. Awesome Noughts is littered with interesting character designs, and Lone Star is kinda just a cowboy, which we could get from tons of indie games. Plus, he was already in another one of those many ill-fated crossover fighting games with the same concept that never got off the ground. Froggy G is cool, but half the current roster for Fraymakers are already aquatic animals, so yeah, I don't know, I feel like we could be starting to hit some really weird redundancy issues here. Leon would be a very cool pick, a kinda stealthy, rush-down assassin, but if I have to pick one, I'm going with heavy metal listening mercenary Clunk, who in the lore has anger issues and is currently trying to save up to get therapy for them. Be like Clunk. My main reason being is that the heavyweight archetype currently solely represented in Fraymakers by Fish Bungeon is going to be hard to get from other indie games. Most indie game protagonists are teenagers with depression, melancholic dudes who walk around wastelands with swords, or anime girls whose breasts are just a bit too much. It's not often we're going to have the opportunity to pull in a big beefy guy, and we got to take that opportunity when we have it. If we're looking at, as I speculate, about a 16 character roster, I think we want at least 2 heavies, and Clunk could be one of the coolest and most interesting heavies you could get. Totally different to Fish Bungeon in almost every conceivable way, really the Bowser of this game. Of particular note, he has this one self-destruct move that does huge damage to himself in exchange for doing even huger damage to his opponent in an area, encouraging him to chase the enemy down in the build-up to the explosion. It's awesome. It makes me think of a more competitively viable version of Heroes Kamikaze from Smash Ultimate. I would love to see this move translated to a fighting game. It would be about the ballsiest decision a design team could make, but you know it'd get spectators on their seats every time it came out. Again, this is my total pie in the sky pick here. There is just no way this is happening, but in an ideal world, this would be my actual dream pick. Some kind of Awesome Noughts rep. I really wouldn't hate Lone Star or Froggy G at all, but Leon, and especially Clunk, I think could make for some really fun and super cool characters. So, Fraymakers did this backer survey for people who supported the game on Kickstarter, asking what kind of characters and other stuff people want to see in the game, and if the popularity polls that have been run by fans since are to be believed, Hollow Knight was a big deal on that survey, perhaps the biggest deal. I also think this is probably the biggest series that could just about still make it in this game. Thing is, a lot of people are vouching for the Knight, and no, the Knight? That's cringe. He's just called the Knight. I hate that. I fucking hate a playable character with the word "the" in the name. I don't like it with the Watcher, I don't like it here. It's even worse if Shovel Knight happens to get in the game, which we'll talk about in a bit. What, you're gonna have the Watcher, the Knight, and Shovel Knight on your roster? Fuck off. Absolutely not. Look to the future, people. Hollow Knight Silksong is launching assumedly before the inevitable heat death of the universe, and Hornet, a character in my mind much more fitting for a fighting game, is set to be the main character. You want to talk about the perfect swordie? I said you couldn't do much better than Zagreus earlier, but you might still be able to do a bit better. You might be able to get Hornet in the game. You might also be able to do a bit better even than this in my book, but again, we'll save it for later. This is a pick that makes a ton of sense if you ask me. Hornet, I personally think, has a cooler design and name and personality than the Knight, who is very much meant to be more of a blank slate, and proportionally I think translates much better to a fighting game like this. You Marth players in Melee want to just keep playing the same character over and over again for the rest of your lives? Boom, here you go, they put Marth in Fraymakers. Almost definitely a top tier in concept alone. Knock yourselves out for another 20 years. Guy Spelunky, yes, that is his name, and Anna, the respective protagonists of Spelunky 1 and 2, are pretty much the perfect picks for a game like this. Spelunky are huge deal indie games that drum up a ton of hype and get a ton of people excited for Fraymakers, but they haven't exploded so much in the public consciousness that they feel intimidating or out of reach. Beyond that, series creator Derek Yu is like the ultimate gamer. No one has or could ever love video games as much as this man does, and he seems so chill, and not to speak for him, but I think if he were approached with the offer of putting Spelunky stuff in Fraymakers, he'd be like, yes, absolutely, I would love to put Spelunky stuff in Fraymakers. Also, I love video games. These characters would of course also translate pretty beautifully to a fighting game as a pseudo-zoner with some rushdown capabilities, I can imagine. It all just works. The whip, the bombs, the jetpack, the dog, the fucking freeze ray, the camera for some reason. The possibilities for a moveset are endless and I think instantly fun, and the stage, complete with its remixes, would no doubt slap too. I just think this is like the perfect pick, and I also think it's one of the most likely ones alongside a Hollow Knight character like we just talked about. I would be so excited to see a Spelunky character get in. Okay, so if I thought Shovel Knight was a reasonable pick here, he would probably be my #1 most wanted character. I wanted him in Smash for the longest time until he was shown off as an assist trophy, and while I've never put serious time into Rivals of Aether, I have seen him in that game and I think he looks awesome. He is basically the Mario of indie games at this point, a mascot, a centerpiece, and a character that makes more sense for a game like Fraymakers than maybe quite literally anyone else. And I'm kinda okay with him not being in, because he's already had those appearances, and not just those appearances, but many more, as is well documented. This dude was in like every other indie game and crossover under the sun, and yes, that includes like another 4 of those ill-fated indie crossover fighters with the same concept as Fraymakers that never got off the ground. I love Shovel Knight, but I do think the well is a bit dry now. I would absolutely not complain about him being a playable character whatsoever, but I also think to avoid fatigue, perhaps he should sit this one out and be an assist instead, because we absolutely do still need to make sure he's in the game somehow. Many people have suggested that in lieu of yet another playable Shovel Knight appearance, we could choose to go with one of the members of the Order of No Quarter who got their own standalone expansion, that being Plague Knight, Spectre Knight and King Knight, and this is a cool idea, and one that I like a lot. All 3 of these would make for unique characters with really diverse playstyles and tons of personality. But I think I have an even better idea, one that yet again involves looking into the future. Yacht Club Games' next game, if you haven't seen it, set to release in the near future, is Mina the Hollower, a top-down action-adventure game that takes heavy inspiration from classic Zelda and Castlevania. I mean, come on. Mina would have relevancy and recency on her side, and I imagine this is the pick Yacht Club would want in the game as a playable character for obvious marketing purposes. And I don't think anyone would take issue with this. Not to review a game before it's even out, but Mina the Hollower is already looking amazing, and more importantly, previewing amazingly with press. It's Yacht Club, who have not missed yet and seem very unlikely to miss here. Mina's game isn't out yet, of course, so you can't quite get a full grasp of her abilities and how she'd play, but between the whip and the mace and the throwing knives shown off in the trailers, I think you can get as much of an idea as you need. This is your more proactive Simon Belmont. She'd make for an awesome character, a great shot in the arm for the marketing of both games, and perhaps the most recent or newest character you could feasibly get playable in the game, which I think would work wonders for making it feel modern and fresh. So, confession, I have never played a Lethal League game, which may make this entry being at number 3 on this list seem somewhat weird. Yes, I would like to see a Lethal League character in Fraymakers, particularly Candyman or Latch, though I think Candyman is most likely as he's the one I see all over the internet and social media the most. My reason being twofold. One, you don't have to have played a game to appreciate it from afar like the rare exotic animal it is. I think Lethal League is cool, and being a kind of fighting game, albeit a very unconventional one, means that these characters could surely translate pretty well into another. Two, character design. Much like Awesome Noughts, Lethal League has some of the coolest and most inspired character design I've seen in an indie game. These super slick, very jet-set radio-inspired characters would be awesome to see realised in a game like this. Yes, I am aware that this team would go on to make Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, that makes all the sense in the world, and between music and a stage, I think they'd bring a kind of style to the game you wouldn't really be able to get anywhere else. Of course, there is a hold-up in terms of how you'd interpret them in a platform fighter. I said that Lethal League is a kind of fighting game, but it's certainly unconventional to say the least. For those unfamiliar, it's kinda like baseball, or that thing Ganondorf does in Ocarina of Time, as a competitive fighting game. How the team could make a character based around hitting a ball back and forth work, I don't know, and there is an argument that they would work better as an assist, but I don't think it's quite as tall an order as some of the other stuff we discussed so far. I'm sure they could figure something out, and I'm sure it'd be rad as hell. Lisa the Painful is one of the most tonally dissonant games ever made, to such an extent that I think it's the biggest obstacle preventing Brad Armstrong, the main character, from getting into Fraymakers. It is disturbing on a level that I don't think a game has matched for me yet. Sure, the Smash team managed to tone down a character like Bayonetta to make her work for a PG environment, but this is on a different level entirely. I don't know how concerned Fraymakers is with adult content, but right now it doesn't look like the kind of game that could make a world like Lisa's really work. Yet, at the same time, Lisa is also one of the funniest and silliest games out there. It is a masterclass in committing to the bit. A lot of the funniest comedic set pieces in all of video games are in Lisa the Painful. Consider the bulldozer sequence. Consider the flashback with Rick and his son. Consider the endless rope, which invites you to climb a rope for upwards of a solid minute, promising something exciting ahead, only for you then to find a middle finger at the top and being told you have to go all the way back down. It's just one of the funniest games ever made, and if we lead into this a bit, I don't think Brad is out the question for Fraymakers, and no, this is not same name bias, I promise. There is a sillier, more mirthful side to Lisa that could make him a fitting pick yet, and his moveset is rife with potential. Brad is a martial arts instructor who can shoot fireballs and enter horse stance, whatever the fuck horse stance is. Basically, he'd be a sillier, more cartoony version of Ryu, which I'd be hugely down for, and the potential for a Terry Hintz or Nern assist justifies his inclusion alone. I don't think it's particularly likely, but God, would I love to see it. Also, I'm going to say my honourable mention here. This is kind of a stand-in because I didn't include it on the list for the same reasons that I was kind of unsure about putting Brad Armstrong on the list. V1 from Ultra Kill. I also, again, I don't know how much they care about adult content. It's not quite as thematically dark as Lisa is, but there's a lot of blood and religious symbolism, but some Ultra Kill stuff would be sick. I'd love that. That's my honourable mention. For years now, A war has raged across the internet between two warring factions of immeasurable size. On one side, you have the Scrimblow Bimblow enjoyers, and on the other, the JRPG McSword Guy fans. But there exists a game that for well over a decade now has united these warring factions in mutual appreciation of its simplistic, archaic majesty. And its name is Castle Crashers, baby! Newgrounds, ancient 2010 era memes, feces! You want to celebrate indie games? You give Tom Fulp, Dan Paladin and Newgrounds their flowers. This is something Fraymakers have already done by featuring Tankman and Fancy Pants as assists, but I think you can go further by having a playable rep, and I don't think there's a better choice than a Castle Crasher. This may be lost on some, but Newgrounds is a hugely influential factor in the success of the modern indie game. Without its community and creators, it's safe to say indie games simply would not exist in the way they do right now. It's a huge deal for programmers, designers, artists and composers, and deserves to be given all the credit it can get. Castle Crashers on its own merit is one of the earliest hugely successful indie games, perhaps only really predated by Cave Story, the IP of which is apparently currently owned by a notoriously sketchy company who might not be willing to play ball. I have a lot of fond memories playing Castle Crashers with friends. It's a game with a ton of charm that still holds up today and is a great relic of the Xbox Live Arcade era of indie games, often an underratedly important moment in their history. This is one of the oldest indie games you could potentially feature in Fraymakers, and it's a hugely important one that I have a lot of love for and think represents a lot of great things about the indie game community. Granted, a character being called just Castle Crasher would bother me quite a lot. I don't know what it is, but characters with two words in their name just bothers me, okay? It just does. But I'd be able to get over it for the sake of getting the swordie in the game. Perhaps the only swordie I could ever see myself maining in such a game. Now, how specifically you would implement this character is a bit of a head scratcher. There are 4 main knights who make up the core Castle Crashers, and each of them fight with a different element. And this is a game designed with 4-player co-op in mind, so none of them is given more importance than the other. Perhaps you could have the 5th Grey Knight as a base and his moves transform him into the other 4, but that would result in a character whose base colour palette is intentionally bland, which I don't really like. Maybe you have one of them, say the Red Knight, as a base, and he uses moves that have properties of the other elements, and also his alternate costumes are the other colours. Maybe you have one base character with all the moves from their element, but the alternate costumes change the properties of their specials. That might be a bit of a challenge and would make them technically 4 separate characters, though they'd be more like Echo Fighters with very minimal differences across the board. Again, we'd just be changing their colour palette and the specific properties of some of their special moves, not actual animations. I don't know, there's a ton of ways you could go with it, but anyway, it would have me hugely excited. I think these guys are so fun and so charming, and there's so much potential to craft a fun and interesting moveset. They would be hugely deserving, and though I'm not usually a swordie guy, they are absolutely my #1 desired pick for Fraymakers. As you can imagine, they were my #1 suggestion for a character in the backer survey. Let's make it happen. Again, I hope this fun little bit of speculation has illuminated just how exciting the premise of Fraymakers is. Slow as progress may have been, I think you only have to watch this game in motion for a bit and see the skill of the team behind it to get how it really could become something special for years down the line. This concept is, in my mind, the only game in this space that has the potential to become as exciting as Smash in the long term. And a reminder that whilst posting this little wish list to YouTube was an attempt on my part to help drum up hype for a project that I think deserves it, a far more tangible way you, as a consumer, can help projects like this succeed is to wishlist them on Steam. Any indie dev will tell you that getting their games wishlisted on Steam is a huge deal for them, so if you're anticipating Fraymakers anywhere near as eagerly as I am, I'd encourage you to do so. I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to Hard Drive. As always, Hard Drive baby, woo, Hard Drive. I hope to hear about the kind of stuff you guys want to see in the game, and most importantly, I hope you look forward to the day that the Scrimblow Scramble can finally become a reality. Peace.